thank Dr. Cloud for being here and sharing her time. As many of you know, she's the director of the Parkinson Center at VCU Health. And we're privileged to have her. She's doing not only amazing clinical work with you all, but also really important research. So without further ado, I'll let her take the stage.
Check it. This is on. This is on. Yeah, you can hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. I see so many familiar faces. Good to see everyone. And obviously, as Margaret said, this is clearly a hot topic. There's a lot of people in this room. So just out of curiosity, I guess, show of hands, raise your hand if you have any problems or issues with your walking. Okay, so that is a majority of the room. So that's good. That explains why we have, so many people here today. So my goal for this talk is to first talk about what happens during normal walking, and there's nothing wrong. What does our body have to do to help us walk normally? And then we'll talk about all the many ways that Parkinson's disease can disrupt that normal walking. And there are many. And then we'll talk about treatment options for some of the most common and most bothersome walking problems in Parkinson's disease. And then at the end, I'm going to introduce you to some research that we're doing at the VCU Parkinson's and Movement Disorder Center that's focused on walking and balance issues. And then I'm also going to introduce you to a new clinical program that we're launching in the new year for people with challenging walking problems. And so that's the agenda for today. In general, I always prefer a more conversational, interactive program. So if you have questions and you don't want to try to remember it, hold it until the end, feel free to just jump in, raise your hand, ask me questions along the way. I prefer that actually. Okay, we already have a question.
I don't think you're coming through the microphone.
Oh, I'm not coming through the microphone. Let's see.
That's quite good.
There's like a. Yeah, I don't need okay, we can get library support staff to help us. I'll hold until I have a microphone. There's a control panel hiding in irritation. Ah.
You go forward.
Yeah, see that. I bet that's it. I'm gonna get to plug it in. Let's see. I was in school for like 35 years. See if I can figure this out. That's it. Am I coming on down? No.
Yeah.
Can you hear you? So if I yell like this, can people hear me? All right, I'll yell until we have a microphone. I don't know how long I can hold out. We'll try. So we're going to start with a little bit of neuroanatomy, very basic neuroanatomy, because it comes into play later in the discussion. So I don't have a pointer, but top right-hand corner, that's your brain in cross section. And the gray part of the brain at the top, like the higher structures, that's your cortex. And that's your thinking brain. That's your consciousness, that's your thinking brain. Everything below that in the deeper parts of the brain that's in color, that's your subcortical structures. And that is not your thinking brain. That's not, where your thinking and your consciousness lives. But it's very important for controlling a lot of automatic things that your body needs to do. And so all you need to remember is cortex is thinking brain and subcortex is not your thinking brain, but still very important for doing the things that we need to do. So that's the neuroanatomy that you need. Walking is an automatic program that runs sort of automatically in the background from these subcortical structures. So, if you think about it, you're never consciously thinking about what you need to do when you walk. You're not saying, okay, I need to swing my right foot forward, and now my right heel is going to touch the ground, and then I'm going to shift my weight onto my right foot, and then I'm going to swing my left one forward. You're not thinking about any of this, right? You're just doing it. It's happening automatically. You don't give it a thought. Because there's this automatic program in the deep parts of the subcortical brain that runs that automatic program for you. So when we think about normal gait or normal walking, we typically divide it into two stages. There's the swing phase and the stance phase. So the swing phase is when one foot is not in contact with the ground and you're basically standing on one foot. So that's when, you're walking, your weight is on the right foot and the left one is swinging forward or vice versa. So that's the swing phase. And then there's the stance phase where both feet have contact with the ground. And so, as you walk, there are intermittent periods of time where both feet are on the ground, and there are periods of time where you're on one foot. So in a normal, healthy person with no orthopedic or neurological issues, thank you. So in a normal, healthy person with no walking problems, as they walk, about 20% of their total gait cycle is when they're in that double support period where both feet are on the ground. That means that the vast majority of the time that you're walking, you're balancing on one foot. And I don't think anybody takes the time to kind of think about and appreciate how much time, as we're walking, we do spend balancing on one foot. Even though this is an automatic program that runs in the background of your brain without you thinking about it, lots of things have to happen to go from, having the intention to walk and actually executing the task. So again, let's just think about all the steps that have to happen. So first of all, your brain has to register and activate that program, right? I have the intention to walk, I have to register that in my brain, and that program has to be initiated. Then you have to transmit those signals and those commands from the brain through the rest of your nervous system down to the lower parts in your leg. And then those nerves in your leg have to activate the muscles to contract and start doing what they need to do. And then as you start to move your muscles, you're creating forces that are moving your joints appropriately so that you can bend your knee, bend your ankle, straighten your knee, straighten your ankle. And that causes your spine to adjust itself as needed in response to the forces against those joints. And then lastly, your brain is aware of the ground beneath your feet. So when you're walking on soft ground versus hard ground, it encounters different forces and you have to adjust how you're walking and the sort of force that you're generating against those joints based on the texture of the ground beneath you. And all of this, this is amazing really, that all of this is happening without you ever giving it a second thought. So there are so many ways that this can go wrong in the context of neurological or orthopedic problems, because there's just so many steps that have to happen to execute this automatic activity that we take for granted until something goes wrong. So I think if you take nothing away from this slide, other than walking is actually really complicated when you look at the nitty-gritty of what happens, and yet our amazing bodies manage to do this automatically for us without us ever having to think about it. So what happens in Parkinson's disease? So, many aspects of gait start to change in Parkinson's disease, and we're going to kind of break it down by early versus mid-stage to advanced Parkinson's disease and kind of go through how things can change. And keep in mind that no two people with Parkinson's are the same, and so not everybody with Parkinson's disease is going to experience all of these gait changes, but you may experience some or many of them. And this may change over time too as your disease evolves. So in early Parkinson's disease, the first signs that we see, and they may be so subtle that the individual doesn't even notice them, but if we really look carefully or measure, we see that the walking slows down. We see that their step length shortens. And so instead of taking nice big steps, they get a little shorter. But it could be almost imperceptible in early disease. The amplitude of the arm swing is reduced. So instead of nice natural arm swing in both arms, when people walk, the arm swing becomes less impressive and gets, smaller and smaller sometimes as the disease progresses. We see more asymmetry between the two sides. So as most of you probably experienced, Parkinson's likes to start on one side of the body. And even though it may eventually spread to the other side of the body, it's always worse on the side on which it starts. And so because of that, the gait slowing, the step length shortening, the arm swing being reduced, tend to be worse on one side of the body than the other in early Parkinson's disease. That leads to a lot of asymmetry in the limb movements in early PD. And then you can see, as a result of all of those changes, people start to develop a reduced range of motion around the joints in the lower extremities. So the hips, knees, ankles may start to have a reduced range of motion. And all of that together may start to manifest itself as walking becoming a little bit less automatic for people. They may have to focus a little bit more, think a little bit more about what they're doing as they navigate the world in order to do so safely and, somewhat naturally. And that tends to be, that loss of automaticity tends to be worse when people are distracted. So if you're trying to do two things at one time, you're more likely to notice these problems in early Parkinson's disease. So, if you're having a conversation while walking, that's a lot harder than if you're just exactly. Someone said chewing gum. That's my favorite line. You stole my line. No, I frequently say in clinic when I'm talking to patients, you should not try to walk and chew gum at the same time. And I kind of sound like a jerk when I say that, but there's truth that any two tasks, when one of them is walking, has the potential to worsen the walking. So as the disease becomes more advanced and people are kind of in the middle years, so to speak, my mic just died. Back to screaming.
Nope. Back up.
Thank you. So as no. Okay. So you start to see spread to the other side of the body as the disease advances. And when that happens, you may see less asymmetry actually. So people's walking may not look quite so lopsided, so to speak. They may not be dragging one leg behind the other because now both sides are affected. And so it actually may even things out a little bit. You also see that there's an increase in double limb support. So remember earlier I mentioned that most of the time that we're walking, we're balancing on one leg under normal circumstances. What we see as PD advances is that people spend more time on both feet and less time balancing on one leg. And you start to see fragmented motor functions. So you get what's called in-block turning. So normally when we go to turn and change directions, it's one smooth motion, one pivot. But in Parkinson's disease, as it advances, we see that people lose the ability to do that. And so they start to turn by taking several steps. And so we call that in-block turning. And then you start to see changes in posture. People may slouch forward or stoop forward. We may see the development of gait initiation problems. So when someone stands up and has the initial intention to start walking, there can be a lag between when they register that in their brain, okay, I want to start walking, and when their feet actually start moving. There can be a lag, and we call that start hesitancy or gait initiation problems. And then there's a phenomenon that we're going to talk about at length called freezing of gait, and its sister destination, which we'll talk about as well. And these problems start often to pop up as the disease advances. And all of this culminates by this time in an increase in fall risk. So in early PD, we may have these subtle changes that we note if we look carefully, but balance tends to be normal and fall risk tends to be low to non-existent, or, you know, the same as a non-Parkinson's disease age-matched counterpart. But as we get to the middle years, fall risk does start to increase. And then in advanced Parkinson's disease, we see a progression of all the things we've already talked about. We see more freezing of gait, it becomes more prominent. And we see changes in balance and postural control. And that all increases fall risk much more dramatically in advanced Parkinson's disease. And then motor fluctuations and dyskinesia that emerge as people live with this disease and take medication for many years can start to impact gait and erode normal gait as well. And lastly, physical endurance and muscle strength tend to decline in the advanced stages of the disease, and that has an impact on gait. And then you may see the need for a cane or a walker or even a wheelchair if balance is severely impaired. And so these are, you know, all of the ways that Parkinson's disease can impact that normal gait. So this is just a little video animation on the right of a advanced Parkinson's patient to illustrate some of these points that we talked about. So you see that this person is taking very small steps, so their stride length is shortened so dramatically that he's almost shuffling or is shuffling. You see that the posture is stooped forward. The arms are not swinging normally when he walks, so there's lots of arm swing. And so this is a kind of classic depiction of a more advanced patient. And the other slide, the other point that this slide is intended to make is that you'll hear neurologists throw the word bradykinesia around a lot. That means slowness of movement. And that is to be differentiated from small movements, which are in our language, in neurology language, referred to as hypokinetic or microkinetic. And all of these are seen in patients with Parkinson's disease, small movements and slow movements. Okay, so then posture and how posture changes in Parkinson's disease. So there are kind of 3 common problems that we sometimes see. Again, not everybody gets these problems, but they do often happen. So there is canticormia, which is tilt forward, bending forward, leaning forward. And this is very common. Usually it's not extreme, it's usually subtle, but there are some cases that can be quite extreme. I mean, you will occasionally meet someone who is almost at 90 degrees when they stand up to try to walk. Fortunately, that is not very common. It's usually much more subtle than that. We also see Pisa syndrome, where instead of just leaning forward, people may also tilt or lean to the side. That tends to be also in more advanced disease. And then we also see anterocallus, which is forward flexion of the neck. So the neck is flexed at baseline, and sometimes excessively so. And all of these can negatively impact your gait and your balance, because if you think about it, if you're bent over, you know, at 45 degrees or more, that's going to shift your center of gravity forward, and that's going to make you much more likely to topple over if anything happens. Similarly, if you have anterocolitis and you're forced to look down all the time because your neck is stuck like this, you're not scanning the horizon for obstacles, you're not able to look at what's going on around you as you normally would, and so that obviously can impact your ability to navigate, the world on your feet in a very profound way. And so these postural abnormalities can impact gait and balance and increase fall risk as well. So then let's talk a little bit more about freezing of gait. So freezing of gait is most commonly defined as a triggered temporary inability to walk despite the intention to do so. So this is where folks are walking, things are going fine, and then all of a sudden their feet are just stuck and glued to the ground. Yet again, their brain is intending for them to continue walking. This can be really subtle. These freezes can be less than a second in duration, or they can last more than 5 minutes. And so the longer they last and the more often they happen, the more debilitating this problem can be. And triggered is a very important word because it really shouldn't just happen for no reason. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But there are some common triggers that have been identified time and time again. So gait initiation is one of them. So we talked earlier about that start hesitancy. Some people, when they first stand up and want to initiate that first step, they have a freezing episode and it takes them some period of time to overcome that and start walking. For many people, changing direction is a trigger for freezing of gait. Any kind of visuospatial transition can be a trigger. So if you are walking through a threshold, like a doorway, that can trigger it. Or if there's a change in the pattern on the floor, if you're walking from a carpeted room to a tile room and there's a change in the pattern or the texture of the floor, at that threshold, you can get a freeze triggered by that. Distraction is a common trigger. So again, we come back to dual tasking and why it's important not to try to do too much other than focus on your walking when you're walking, but dual tasking or being in a crowded, chaotic, cluttered environment, these can be triggers for freezing. Some patients report that they feel like it's happening spontaneously. They can identify a trigger, but it really shouldn't. And so when people tell us that, that usually gives us a clue that they may have some problems with their attention. Maybe some, attention problems, and that may be kind of triggering those seemingly spontaneous freezes. So really it's more distraction and they're just not maybe consciously realizing the distraction because it's internal, not external, if that makes any sense. So let's look at a video of freezing of gait so you can get an idea of what this looks like if you've never experienced it. So this man is walking normally until he goes to turn and watch his feet. All of a sudden, those feet are stuck to the ground. And this is someone who's taking nice big steps. The feet were clearing the ground. I mean, he was walking essentially normally until he went into that turn. And then when he left the turn, he was able to get out of the freeze and start walking normally. So that's freezing of gait. Freezing has a companion problem called festination. This is less common than freezing, but it's not uncommon. And this is often described as shuffling, but if you really look closely, it's a bit different from just garden variety shuffling. So in festination, there's an increase in the step cadence. So what that means is that the feet move faster and faster and faster and faster as people are walking. They almost feel like their feet run away on their own and they lose control and they're just moving faster and faster and faster. The steps simultaneously become smaller and smaller and smaller, and the feet tend not to clear the ground, so it's therefore often described as shuffling. People aren't really picking their feet up off the ground. And it can commonly precipitate a freeze or a fall. It's quite dangerous. And so let's look at a video of festination.
Fascinating gait is one one in which the patient involuntarily moves with short accelerated.
See how the steps are getting faster and shorter from the starting point?
It is seen in Parkinson's disease and other neurologic conditions. This gait leads to increased frustration in the client due to high amounts of.
See the pickup in the speed
While the client.
and the steps get shorter, so that's destination.
Gait.
Okay, so we're gonna shift gears a little bit now and talk about management, evaluation and management of all of these gait changes and what we can do about it. So if we lived in a perfect world, which we all know we don't, we would go through this very systematic evaluation for any patient who is experiencing gait problems in the context of their Parkinson's disease, and, you know, for freezing of gait. So the first question that we really want to try to ascertain the answer to is, does this person's walking problem get better when they take their PD medication? Or does it get worse when they take their PD medication? So is it something that is more likely to happen when they're on, or is it more likely to happen when they're off? Surprisingly, that can sometimes be really hard to sort out because again, you know, people are not paying attention all the time, right? To, you know, walking is such an automatic thing. You're not thinking about it, and all you know is, you know, you're freezing intermittently. And unless you're really paying attention to the timing of when these episodes occur in relation to your doses of medication, you may not intuitively know the answer to this question. Sometimes we actually have to give people a homework assignment and say, I want you to go home for a few days and pay attention to this and take notes in a diary and help us figure this out, because it's not always so easy. The other thing is, you know, if they have deep brain stimulation, does their stimulator make the problem better or worse? Did it start after they got their DBS, or did it get better after they got their DBS? Is it better when their stimulator is on versus off? And again, they may not intuitively, immediately have that answer, and we may have to spend some time trying to sort that out. But we need to know those questions before we can really do anything, because obviously the treatment approach is going to be very different if this is something that is, you know, brought on by medications or stimulation versus something that's improved by medications or stimulation. Freezing of gait can absolutely be an on medication phenomenon or an off medication phenomenon. And so this is kind of step one. So then if it's medication responsive or stimulation responsive, we can chase that pretty easily for treatment by optimizing medications, optimizing DBS programming, making sure that we're doing what we can to manage the symptoms that way. Where we run into more of a challenging situation is when it's not medication responsive and we have to come up with other ways to intervene and manage the problem. So for freezing of gait, we at that point usually want to identify that individual's unique triggers. We talked about the fact that there are triggers for freezing of gait. Not everybody is triggered by all those scenarios that I mentioned. Some people are only triggered by turns. Some people are only triggered by clutter. And so trying to figure out what the individual's unique triggers are so that you can either train them to avoid those triggers or learn to adapt and work around those triggers. And that's where our physical therapy colleagues are so important, because this is the bread and butter of what they do when they evaluate a Parkinson's patient with gait problems and falls and freezing of gait. They're really looking to try to understand what is driving this person's freezing, and then they're looking to rehabilitate you so that those triggers are no longer triggers, if possible. So then next, we want to gauge the individual's responsiveness to cueing devices if they have freezing of gait. So we're going to talk more about cueing devices in a minute, so I'm not going to belabor this too much. But some people respond to cueing devices for freezing of gait and other people do not. And so our physical therapy colleagues will often, in a physical therapy session, provide a cueing device for the individual to use in therapy to determine if it helps them or not. And if it does, we can get you a prescription for one to
have at home and use all the time. And then lastly, there is sometimes a role for adjustments in non-Parkinson's disease medications if we determine that your cognition or your attention or anxiety is playing a role in your walking problem or your freezing of gait, and they often do. And so we have to evaluate the cognition and the attention and the mood and address those issues as well. So in a perfect world, we would do this for everybody with freezing of gait. In reality, we don't. And the reasons for that are, largely based on time constraints and resource constraints, right? Not everybody has access to a physical therapist. They may live in a very rural area where there, is no Parkinson's trained PT that they can see. Not all neurologists, in fact, most neurologists don't have the time to bring a patient in off meds and off stim and really look at their walking and then have them take their meds and look at them again while they're on their meds and then on and off stim and really trying to figure out what's going on. And so, the reality is that you go to a 30-minute follow-up with your neurologist and there's like one question about walking and freezing, and then they do their best to try to, make a decision about what to do, but it's not ideal and it's not often personalized enough to really get to the root of the problem. And so just a little bit more about physical therapy. So there have been studies for freezing gait showing that physical therapy is more effective than no physical therapy for treating freezing of gait. So we have good data to suggest that it does help. Most of the effectiveness is in the short term, during or shortly after you complete the physical therapy. But there can be, we're learning more and more that there can be some long-term benefits as well, particularly for patients who really embrace and internalize the skills and the tools that they learn from PT. I think we have a question in the back.
When you said cueing devices at home.
We're going to talk more about that, I promise. That's, I think, my next slide.
Okay.
Yeah. Once the physical therapists get their hands on you, they have a variety of strategies that they use to try to train you so that you can overcome some of these gait difficulties and more safely navigate the environment. And I am gonna not belabor the details here. I'm not a PT, and I think I won't do it justice. Okay, so let's talk more about cueing devices. So cueing in general is the concept of providing some kind of external cue when someone is freezing to help unfreeze them. And it can come in the form of an auditory cue, so a sound cue. So people may have a metronome that they carry around with them because that rhythmic metronome beating helps them consciously pace themselves when they walk. Right foot, left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot, left foot. And that can help a lot of people who have freezing of gait avoid freezing, or when they do have a freeze, it can help them get out of it. Cueing can also come in the form of a visual cue. So the most common one that is out on the market and the insurance pays for is a laser cue that can be attached to your walker or a cane that projects a red laser line on the floor just in front of where your feet are at the time that you're using it. And that provides a visual line, and you can tell your brain, okay, I need to step over that line. And just having that pattern on the floor and consciously telling yourself, I'm gonna now step over it, snaps you out of that automatic program running in the background that's clearly not working in that moment, and causes you to make a different movement, which can then overcome the freeze and get you going again. So that's how visual cues work. And then they can also be tactile, so you can deliver like electrical stimulation or vibration stimulation to some part of the body to cue patients as well, to again draw their attention to what they're doing and overcome a freeze. So the exact mechanism of how and why cueing works isn't entirely known, but it comes, we think, back to the early neuroanatomy lesson that we had at the very beginning of the talk. So we think that when you provide a cue of any kind, it's causing patients to not try to use that program, that automatic program in the subcortical structures that has gone awry. And instead, it's drawing your attention, so your thinking brain is being pulled into the task, so your cortex or prefrontal cortex gets sucked into the task, and your thinking brain is not malfunctioning in that moment, right? It's those subcortical structures that are malfunctioning. And so by using a cueing device to pull in your attention and your thinking brain, you use a different program to initiate the movement than you do with that sort of automatic default program. And so we think that's how and why they work, but the truth is we don't know. So auditory and visual cueing devices have some practical limitations that make them not great for everybody. Obviously, if you have a metronome or music that you're playing at all times when you walk, that can be a problem, right? It can hinder your ability to hear what's going on around you, which can be a safety concern in some environments. It can inhibit your ability to have a conversation with people. I had a patient, I will never forget him. He moved away sadly, so I had to refer him to one of my friends on the other coast. But he had bad freezing and gait, and he responded so beautifully to auditory cues that he had an iPad that he kept in a bag that he carried with him everywhere, and he would crank the volume up as loud as it would go. So like you could hear him coming from a mile away. And he played classical music because he could pace himself to the rhythm of music and, avoid freezing. But it was a real problem to try to have a conversation with him because the music was like deafening. So there are some practical limitations to the cues that are auditory. And then the visual ones are, sometimes a problem too, because if you're constantly having to look down at the ground to see that laser cue and step over it, you're not attending to what's on the horizon. And that's a problem sometimes. So these devices can help, but they're not great, especially for people who freeze constantly. And so for those reasons, a lot of people would argue that the tactile cues like electrical stimulation or vibratory stimulation that you wear somewhere on your body might be a more practical solution because you don't have those safety issues or, communication issues.
I've got a question regarding the cues when you're initiating walking versus when you're walking, per se.
Both can help. Or both can benefit from cues. So the question for anybody who couldn't hear it in the back was to differentiate between using cues when you're freezing because of initiation of gait versus if you're in the middle of walking and you have a freeze in the middle of walking. And the answer is you can use a visual cue in either context. So, in either context, you would just deploy the laser cue on the ground in front of you by pushing down on the cane or pushing the button on the walker, and look and step over it. But again, that requires, number one, that you're cognitively intact and can man the equipment. You have to have the physical dexterity to be able to push the button, and that may not always be true. If you're at the end of dose and your meds are wearing off, that may be a problem. So these are not perfect solutions. These are the best we have right now, but they're not perfect.
How would the tactile piece work for initiation?
We're going to talk in detail about that in a few minutes, but there are multiple devices out there internationally that provide tactile cues. Some of them provide stimulation all the time. I would argue that that's a terrible idea, and I'll explain why in a minute. Others you can activate on some sort of rhythm to kind of cue you rhythmically, almost like an auditory cue. So there's a device that's on the market in other parts of the world, not the US yet, called Q1 that you wear on your sternum, and it vibrates. And you can program it to vibrate at a particular pattern or rhythm. So if we know your walking speed or cadence is a certain level, we can program it to vibrate, to pace you at a level that matches where you're at right now. And so you can do it that way. Or you can do what I'm gonna propose in a few minutes, which is get a really smart device that knows when you froze and vibrates you then and only then. But that's not easy to do.
What about dancing and bicycle?
Yeah, so you can theoretically freeze in any context, so it doesn't just have to be walking. So you can freeze during any motor activity. But interestingly, dancing and riding a bicycle, those are different programs and they're not automatic programs. They require more planning and executive function and moment-to-moment decision-making. And so they seem to be less vulnerable than the walking, which is that sort of automatic background task. So some people use that as a way to get out of a freeze. Like if they freeze, they think, okay, I'm gonna, yes. And people who don't want to do that, be so obvious about it, are trying to kind of not draw attention to themselves, will just sort of start shifting their weight a little bit, side to side, and then they can kind of get out of it. But I like the dancing idea. Much happier, better way to do it. Yes.
Just one more thing, I don't have freezing, but I do when I go walking, after a certain amount of time, my right foot starts dragging.
Mhm.
On my iPod, I noticed, I just had it on shuffle. I still have one of those iPods with the wires to my ears. Certain songs, it would stop dragging. So I created a playlist of songs that have the same backbeat in them.
That is amazing.
And then I can go for 3 or 4 miles and never drag my foot if those songs are.
And have you been able to figure out what it is about those songs? Is it the beat of the?
It's the beat of the song is the beat
Yeah.
of my normal walk.
So then you would probably respond so well to a Q1 device. Because you could set it to your unique cadence, and wear it, and then you don't have the musical component. Now they're not available in the United States yet, but you can run Europe and have it sent to you. And a lot of people do that. So yeah, that's fascinating.
But with the old technology, with the wire earbuds, I can leave one out while I'm walking so I can hear cars or dogs.
Yeah.
Things, but still give the music in the other ear.
Fascinating.
And I just stumbled across, I don't know what it was, but I just happened to notice that, I'd be walking and then all of a sudden I'd be dragging and then I wouldn't. And it would be some CCR song on or something. So then I went through all the songs on my iPod and started picking out the ones that had the same.
This is a great story. I need to interview you on camera for future talks that I give. We'll talk later. Great story.
I don't have freezing, but when I walk, if I'm in an area that's wide open, I count cadence in my head. And the cadence of left, right, right, keeps me going.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're sort of cueing yourself with auditory rhythm, it sounds like. Yes.
I use counting. I count
Mhm.
when I walk, if I'm having trouble sometimes. I'll start counting like as I step and things out. But what I'm wondering is, I can have trouble walking. I can go to a really heavy exercise class like low impact aerobics. And I can jump around and do all this stuff without any problem, no.
Yeah, that goes back to the question about dancing, and I think because those are not automatic, right? When you're in that exercise class, you are very deliberate with every movement that you make. And those more intentional things are less vulnerable to the breathing than that automatic gait program, which breaks down. Because again, the subcortical structures, the basal ganglia is the area that is most abnormal in patients with Parkinson's disease. And that's also unfortunately where the Gait program initiates from. And so when you're dancing and you're following the instructions of the instructor at the front of the dance class, you're using your thinking brain, not your deeper subcortical structures.
Dr. Cloud, quick question, do you find with patients that with, cueing to overcome freezing, that over time, that type of cueing is not as effective or is ineffective, and you have to change the cueing to another method?
Great question. So for anybody who couldn't hear, the question is, for patients who use cueing devices, do you find that over time they become less responsive and you have to change the approach or to a different cueing device? It depends is the answer. So, one of the concerns with, constant cueing, the reason we don't like to leave the laser light on all the time on the cane or the walker, or why we don't really like the vibrating device to vibrate all the time, is because there is the potential for habituation. Your brain gets used to that signal and that noise, and then what do we do when our brain gets used to something? We tune it out, right? This is why your spouse may scream at you sometimes and say, "Why are you listening to me?" Because I've been listening to you every day for 30 years, so my brain now tunes your voice out. So it's that phenomenon. And so it does help to make the cueing intermittent, so that you reduce the potential for habituation. But even still, sometimes it can happen, and I have seen patients who either change it up or just put it aside for a while and then come back to it. You know, but then just taking a break sometimes for a little while can kind of reset the responsiveness.
It doesn't have to be something that's different, it's something that is, I mean, walking is, just like it's a involuntary, movement, but if you have to step over a line, if you're stepping over that line all the time, you may not, once you kind of adjust to that, and that line kind of then just becomes something that's difficult to step over. I mean,
We don't usually see that. I mean, if someone responds well to a visual cue, they tend to respond
stay with it, okay?
typically. But they may occasionally take breaks here and there, but it tends to be, for the people who are good responders, which not everybody is, it tends to be a nice lasting benefit. Okay, so, let's talk a little bit more about vibration, since that is just a personal interest of our group. So vibration has become increasingly popular as a cueing device internationally. And there are all sorts of these devices on the market, worn on different parts of the body, and they all work a little bit differently. Some vibrate all the time, some vibrate on a rhythmic pattern that you get to set. But the concept is the same in all cases. These are devices that are serving as a tactile cue to help with various Parkinson symptoms, including freezing of gait. So interestingly, there is not a single randomized controlled trial anywhere that has clearly established the efficacy of vibration for this purpose. And nobody has studied systematically, at least until very recently, how to use this optimally. So what dose of vibration do people need? Vibration has a frequency and an amplitude, and so you can vibrate somebody really hard or you can vibrate them a little bit. And what do you really need for optimal sensory cueing in the context of Parkinson's disease? Well, nobody knows. And so if you look at these devices on the market all over the world, they're all doing different stuff. And there's no science to back up any of it. And yet patients are shelling out money from their own pocket, because insurance doesn't pay for these devices because there's no data, to buy these devices and use them, even though there may not be, a robust evidence-based, literature to back that up. So we also don't know where to put the vibration, optimally. Do you put it on the foot? Do you put it on the trunk? Do you put it on some devices you wear on the hands, like a bracelet or a watch? And so all of these are questions with no answers, because nobody's done the research. Companies just, take their devices to market and sell directly to consumers to get out of spending the money and the time to do the work. So to try to address some of these questions, our group did a study that was funded by the Michael J. Fox Foundation a few years ago to try to figure out the basics. What is the right dose of vibration? And so we have a device that my colleague had developed and used previously that delivers vibration to the foot of the wearer. You can just tuck it in your shoe, wear it inside your shoe. And we looked at a wide range of vibration doses to really try to determine which dose was optimal for the majority of Parkinson's disease patients. And then once we answered that question and figured out, okay, what is the optimal frequency of vibration and amplitude of the vibrating, device, we compared that dose to a placebo. And so for the placebo, we had patients wear the device, but it just wasn't vibrating. And we did a head-to-head trial to see if it worked at that optimal dose. And we did find that it worked, but this device delivered vibration in this study constantly. So that comes back to your question about habituation. So what we observed was interesting. In the trial, we observed that people would initially improve with all their walking measurements that we were taking, but then over time, the benefit would kind of peter out. And so we speculated that it was because this device was vibrating them constantly while they were walking. If they were moving, it was vibrating. And we think they were getting used to it and their brain was tuning it out and it wasn't working as well anymore. And so it dawned on us that we really need a device that is smart enough to know when the patient is freezing and vibrate them only at that time. And so we partnered with some wonderful computer scientists at William and Mary and put in a grant to get funding to try to develop such a device. And so over the last 4 years, we have had some funding from the NIH to do just that, to develop a device that was essentially a closed loop system that you would wear on the foot and ankle that would analyze your walking in real time, know what you're doing at all times, recognize when you freeze, and at that split second, when it recognizes a freeze, it delivers the vibration and then stops. And so the nuts and bolts of our system are sort of shown here in this diagram. So there's the device on the patient's ankle, and there's 2 vibrating tactors inside the shoe, one on the top of the foot and one on the side of the ankle. And inside the device, there's a motion sensor, which is actually very crude. It's super cheap technology. It's an accelerometer and a gyroscope of the same kind that are inside your iPhone. So, widely available, inexpensive, tiny hardware for motion sensing. And then the real magic is in the computer science programming of an app on your smartphone that helps the motion sensor feedback from the accelerometer and the gyroscope run it through, very lightning fast machine learning models, know whether you're in the normal walking state or the freezing state. And then as soon as it identifies a shift from normal walking to freezing, the smartphone tells the device to vibrate. And so that was kind of the concept behind what we were doing. So the advantages of this approach we've already talked about. So you get away from the practical limitations of the laser canes and the walkers and the auditory cueing. You avoid the habituation that happens from constant stimulation. And so it has a lot of advantages. It's also very lightweight and portable and attached to the individual and can easily be covered by a pant leg. And so it's discreet. It's inside the shoe and under the pant leg, as opposed to a laser cane or a walker with a laser cue, which is, much more conspicuous. This is just another picture to show you what it looks like on the foot of someone who's wearing the vibrating tactors inside their shoe. The blue dots are where the tactors are underneath the shoe. And then the device on their ankle is the kind of brains and the accelerometer and the gyroscope that do the motion sensing. So how did we do? How did this perform in patients in clinic? So This is data from the first 11 patients, and in those 11 patients, we were able to capture 716 freezing events because we put them through a very rude obstacle course that is booby trapped with all the triggers of freezing and gait. I'll show you the obstacle course in a minute, but they didn't like it very much. And our device was able to find 99.4% of the freezing and gait events. So it's very sensitive. It doesn't miss that very often. But we did find a problem with our false positives. So it often thought someone was freezing when in fact they were just turning around and it was a normal healthy turn, not a freezing turn. And so we pretty quickly realized we had a problem after just the first 11 patients, and we had to figure out a way to solve it. So the reason for the problem with the turns is that Parkinson's patients find all kinds of creative ways to turn around. So some people turn by taking forward steps with both feet. Some people turn by taking backward steps with both feet. Some people turn by taking one step forward and then pivoting. Some people turn by taking one step back and pivoting. And this was just making the poor computer models blow up because they were like, I don't know what's going on. This person must be freezing. When in fact, they were just turning. They weren't frozen, but because the foot pattern didn't mimic normal walking where it was forward, 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 the models were super confused. So we had to figure out how to solve that. So again, my brilliant computer science colleagues at William and Mary came up with a plan for this. And so we watched videos of all of this, which was recorded and labeled every single turn to identify which one of those patterns people were turning with. And then they built in customized features into their model inside the smartphone so that it could recognize these different patterns as a normal turn as opposed to a freeze. And when we did that, we got 112% reduction in the false positive rate and solved our false positive. That paper about that troubleshooting was presented at an international meeting that happens every year called the Chase Conference. It's the biggest international meeting on smart and connected health. And it actually won, I'm gonna humble brag here for a minute, best paper at the entire conference, which is amazing. My computer science colleagues were elated because it was a huge, very huge accomplishment for them. And it was theirs entirely. I mean, they are brilliant. Moving forward, now that that grant has concluded, as of actually next month, that grant concludes. And I'm not telling you about the efficacy because we haven't finished analyzing that data yet. So maybe next time I'll tell you about the efficacy data. I don't have it yet in terms of how it helped in actually making people freeze less when they were wearing it in the real world, because we did that in the last year of the grant. But moving forward, our next goal is to make the device even better by not just analyzing the patient's gait, but analyzing the environment for triggers for freezing and gait. And the idea is that if we can recognize the trigger as the patient's approaching the trigger, we can potentially intervene and vibrate proactively before they freeze and maybe prevent the freeze from happening in their known trigger. And so we're doing this using LiDAR technology. LiDAR is essentially using lasers to bounce off surfaces in the environment, and then the light comes back and the device can know how far away you are, judge the distance. This is how Teslas drive themselves, actually. They use LiDAR to auto-navigate the environment. And it turns out that your smartphone has LiDAR in it. And so you can use a simple smartphone and have the patient wearing it on their body, like in their pocket, on their chest, and use the LiDAR technology and the camera in it to analyze the world around you. And so we have put in another grant to the National Science Foundation to incorporate the cameras and the LiDAR in the smartphone to analyze the environment, recognize transitions like pattern floor changes on the horizon, clutter, loud environments using the microphone, because that's a distraction and a trigger. And essentially adding environmental analysis into these models, in addition to simultaneously monitoring the patient's walking response to the trigger as they approach it, so that we can figure out if we can abort the freeze before it actually even starts.
And so hopefully we'll get the funding and be able to do that over the next 5 years. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about, how am I doing on time? Okay, I gotta speed up. We are in the process of executing on a plan to launch a big Gait and Balance initiative at VCU that was made possible by a very generous philanthropic donation. By someone in the room. I don't know if they, am I allowed to talk about this? Okay, so the Rogliano family actually is responsible for the initial donation that has made this possible. So we are launching a new clinical program, I'm going to tell you about in a minute, that will provide that perfect world evaluation and management of walking problems and freezing and gait to patients who need it. And because it'll be really the only one in the world like it, I think it's going to become a national destination. I think people will come from all over to have the kind of evaluation that we're going to be able to provide that we would never be able to provide, quite frankly, without philanthropic support, because again, insurance doesn't really want you to spend 9 hours with someone, you know, evaluating them on and off meds and on and off stim and putting them through booby-trapped obstacle courses and really figuring out what their problems are and figuring out how to solve them. That takes too much time. It's too expensive. But we're going to do it and it's going to be awesome. And so there's the diagnostics and evaluation arm. And then there's the treatment arm. So we'll be in that same clinical setting trying to develop customized treatment plans that really address the individual's unique set of circumstances and issues. And then there's a research arm, a research incubator. So we have seed funding that we can provide researchers from anywhere. They don't have to be from VCU. We'll fund anything from anywhere. It's a good idea. But anyone who's doing research related to gait problems in Parkinson's disease can come to us with an idea. We can kind of help develop, you know, protocols and fund pilot projects that will hopefully lead to, you know, more larger grants and high quality work. So the Gait clinic is going to involve that extensive neurological exam in all of the conditions necessary to figure out what's going on. So we'll do off-on exams with meds and stim if we need to. We will put them through our obstacle course, which is shown here. So the most common triggers for freezing and gait are tight turns. So, you know, turning 540 degrees in place, dual tasking. So walking while doing something like naming all the animals that you can think of or naming the 50 states. We put them through narrow passageways in the hallway, increasingly narrow. We have them approach a visual target. We give them timed tasks because time pressure is a trigger for some people. So we put a cell phone on the table and we have them walking back and forth past the table, and randomly we make it ring and they have to get to the phone as fast as possible. And like I said, we weren't very nice people. And so we put them through this in the clinic hallway and we're able to figure out, okay, what is this person's unique trigger, or is it multiple? Do they have multiple triggers? And then we can go to our physical therapy colleagues who are with us in the clinic and say, this person freezes when they are on medication, turning around, and they freeze when they are off medication and off stimulation when they approach a visual target. I mean, we can literally pinpoint exactly what the problems are and hand it over to our physical therapy colleagues who can then do their thing and try to help us train patients you know, around some of these triggers. And then on the medical side, we can do the programming, the medication adjustments, and the things that we need to do to really attack the problem in a comprehensive way. And then also we do a number of clinical studies and trials for, you know, motor function and gait. And so patients coming through the clinic will have the opportunity to have access to experimental devices and therapeutics through the clinical trials program. So this is launching in the clinic, is launching in the new year. And we are happy to take all comers with Parkinson's disease and gait problems that have not been fixed by traditional medical models. And we've already talked about the purpose of research incubator. I have gone longer than I wanted, so I'm not gonna talk about the last two slides. We're gonna skip them. I was gonna give you a little bit of a glimpse at some other projects that we're gonna do in the future, but I think in the interest of time, I'm not gonna do that. So just a quick shout out to our team, our Gait team. So my computer science colleague at William and Mary is Dr. Zhou. He is a magician. I'm not kidding. 5 years ago, when we were sitting in a room and I said, I would love it if you could make this device only vibrate when the patient freezes. He was like, I can do that. And I laughed. I was like, yeah, okay. He did it. And he has attacked every problem that we've encountered that way. They are just amazing with the things that they can do with computer science these days. And then Dr. Pretzer-Avoff is my partner in crime for all of these Gait-related projects. She's a research nurse scientist in the School of Nursing at VCU. And she actually has the background in studying vibration. So vibration is her interest, and that's the expertise that she brings to the table. And so the three of us do everything together. All of our grants are co-PI grants across the three of us. And then we have a number of students and research assistants that work with us, and a biostatistician. And the primary research coordinator on most of our Gait studies is Gina Blackwell, but Ginger Norris is also a coordinator who works closely with us in a number of these studies. She is in the back of the room, so say hi, Ginger. And so if anybody is interested in coming to see us in the Gait clinic, for now, you can either send me a message through Epic if you're an existing VCU patient, or if you're not a VCU patient, you can send me an email at that email address and we will give you a call and schedule you in the new year. Tell your friends, if you know anybody with Parkinson's and walking problems you think would benefit from the clinic, spread the word. We are new and we are looking for business. If you're interested in being a research participant in any of these Gait studies, you can email Gina at this email address. And if you would like to support our work in any way, you can reach out to Allie, who's also in the room. She's sitting over there at that email address. And so I'm gonna stop talking because I'm gonna talk for a long time. And y'all are probably tuning me out instead of intuition. So questions, any lingering questions?
I was on the wait list for that Q1. How do you go ahead and just find another distributor that is international?
You go to the company website, and I will tell you, you might want to wait.
Oh, okay.
And here's why you might want to wait. They are in the process of gearing up to do a big multi-center trial in the United States to get FDA clearance. And we will probably be in sight. And so we need the device for free at the end of the trial if you respond to it. And so it's a chance to try it for free. And then if you keep it as a gift to you, the company, she's gonna let you keep it. So you may want to hold off because if you pay for it out of pocket and import it, it is not going to be cheap. But you can technically go to their website and do that. And a lot of people do. Yeah.
Have you ever heard of platform vibration?
Absolutely. I own a platform.
Well, I do too.
Yeah.
But is it supposed to be a total body help for Parkinson's?
It is total body goodness for everybody, whether they have Parkinson's or not. So the question was about vibrating plates that you stand on that vibrate your whole body. So there's actually really good data for the, most of the studies came from Scandinavian countries, but they did some really nice randomized controlled trials where they took a group of patients who were trying to lose weight and they did a controlled diet plan and a controlled regular exercise plan for half the patients. And for the other half, they were randomized to the same diet and exercise plan, but it incorporated some exercise standing on a vibration plate. And the group that did the vibration lost more weight and they lost weight faster. They increased their bone density. So it's good for aging individuals who have to worry about bone density. It increased their metabolism. It increased their muscle mass. So the idea is that, you know, by vibrating, you're literally activating every single individual muscle fiber, not just the whole muscle group. So I have one, I do my squats every day on it. It's so much harder
But I've dropped like 3 pant sizes since April because of that thing, you know, like I am a believer. And so they're not that expensive. You can buy one off Amazon for, you know, there's a range. You can get it for like $150, or you can spend a little bit more money and get a slightly nicer, heavier one for around $300. But especially for, you know, older adults who are worried about losing muscle mass with Parkinson's disease, bone mass, you know, it's a great idea. All you have to do is stand on it. You don't even have to do squats. You can literally just stand on the thing for 10 minutes a day and get a ton of benefit from it.
Yeah.
So can you tell I like my vibration? Right.
Well, don't you think on YouTube they'd have some sort of a person that would do a
Yes.
program?
They do, and when you buy the brand that I have called Life Pro, and when you buy it, they send you a workout program with it to do and resistance bands and
Yeah.
everything else. Yeah. Gary,
I just want to say a big thank you to Dr. Powell and all his colleagues, and all the other Parkinson's disease, besides through my life. Big thank you to all of you.
any other questions?
In one of the early slides, I forget the term you used, on block or whatever for turning. Does that apply to curves as well? I used to never think about curves, just walking, you just kind of naturally go on, and now I find myself kind of stopping, put my foot down, put the other foot down, and then start walking.
Yeah, it probably is the same phenomenon. It's that defragmentation of what was once a smooth, you know, execution of a movement. It probably is the same
And
phenomenon.
there
I
wasn't
don't hear
something-
that as much, but I think it's because it's not as common that you have to step up and down off the curve as it is that you have to turn around,
Right.
right? And I certainly am not doing that in
thought
clinic.
about it until somebody walked me, but you pointed out.
Yeah,
What I was doing every time we came to a curve.
but you know, that's why the physical therapists in the gym have steps, right? So that they can watch you and kind of figure out exactly what's happening in their situations. Yes,
Breathing affect other motions like moving your right foot from the left pedal to the brake.
yes. It can affect any body movement. And it's not just your legs, I mean, your arms, you know, breathing anywhere at any time. But it's more likely to happen with those automatic type behaviors than less likely to happen when you're consciously thinking about what you're doing. So driving is a good one because you zone out and it becomes automatic, right, with time. So I bet that probably is pretty common. I don't ask the question, so I don't really know, but. Show of hands, who's had freezing of their foot while driving? Anybody else?
No, that's what they need.
It's not here, you don't have to worry. It's your cars. You're my friends. All right.
Is there ever a time that freezing can be brought on by either a virus or a COVID injection?
Excellent question. Yes. Yes, excellent question. So, when people get sick from anything, whether it's a virus or a bacterial infection or a fungal infection, we often see the freezing gets worse. Actually, we see all motor function get worse in the context of their illness. Don't worry, it's not permanent. Once the illness subsides, people typically resume life as usual, but it can take some time, especially if it was a serious infection and you were quite ill. It can be a while before you bounce back. And I did have a lot of people call my clinic and say after a COVID vaccine, they felt like their Parkinson's symptoms got worse temporarily. And interestingly, the 2 or 3 that like got really bad, so bad that I had to bring them in, had done COVID and flu vaccines on the same day. And I think it was just too much stress on their body to do them both on the same day. So I actually started telling people, stop doing that. Spread them out. Yeah. It was you.
It was me.
That was
I told you one day.
Yeah, terrible idea. Terrible idea. I don't know why they thought it was
I thought it was getting tough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would the same be true for injuries, like if you have a physical injury, same thing would happen?
Any stressor, even an emotional stressor, like if people get really upset about something, we'll see that their symptoms temporarily worsen. Any disturbance in the force can make things temporarily worse. All right,